Sarah Perry's a perfect example of what William Sight said in his definitive book in 1961 called The Art of Assemblage. And I quote, "Work is predominantly assembled rather than painted, drawn, modeled, or carved." But Sarah, you do it all.
Yeah, I actually have roots in assemblage by using found materials, but I no longer consider myself an assemblage artist because the materials are so altered and so sculpted that it doesn't read as two things or disparate objects just placed together. I will make a huge rocket out of cattle bones, but that to me is beyond what assemblage started as. It's not merely juxtaposing two things together without altering them.
Yeah. Do you have a label for yourself?
No.
Sculptor?
Sculptor is what I call myself, just a sculptor. Very open.
And have you always worked like this, or did you begin life as an artist in another medium?
I began life as an artist as a tiny, tiny little girl putting found objects together. That was my first thing, was making things out of seeds in the backyard and playing with grasses. And so it's very natural for me to work with primarily natural objects when I was little. And then I started drawing, and drawing very tight realism. I could draw people's portraits and things, and in high school you got a lot of strokes for that. And so I drew very realistically. At one point I even thought I might be a scientific illustrator. But my love is sculpture. I think in sculptural terms. When I'm imagining an idea, I see it three-dimensionally. It's not two-dimensional. I see the back and the sides and the front, and my sketches for the thing have all of those elements at once, like you're looking through the thing. It's actually easier for me to sculpt a face than to draw it. I just see the world that way.
The first memory I have of your work is that group of life-size gorillas in 1984 were at the Municipal Gallery. Those were made from tire treads?
They were made from the cast-off tires of primarily trucks and some cars off the side of the freeway. And I drive way out towards Baker and Barstow and pick up the tires, throw them in the back of the truck, and bring them home. The gorillas have a steel armature inside, welded, and then the tires are wrapped around, cut and fitted exactly, drilled, and then sewn onto the steel armature.
What form does the armature take? Is it like just a T, or do you like
It's very detailed. It looks like a gorilla. It has rounded rebar inside and then welded tabs all over it, so I can attach the tire to these flat pieces of steel tabs that have cut incised cuts on them, so I can drill and sew right onto the steel. The idea came from driving on the freeway in the wee hours of the morning, coming back from some god-awful party, and looking at that white line going down the road, and looking at all the trash on the side of the road, and thinking, you know, all that refuse is going to come back and haunt us. Here it is, just amassing. And I started thinking, like, what would happen if it amasses at night by itself? You know, and lopes down the freeway, this man-beast thing. I thought, my God, man-beast, half man, half beast. A gorilla out of just the tires coming back at us. Yeah.
Have you always used animals as your subject matter in one form or another? I mean, whether it's the medium or what?
No. I'm going back to, you know, when I was an adolescent, but as an adult, Yes, there's always been an animal influence.
Why?
In the pieces that I utilize animal parts or the image of an animal, they're there as an identification, a source of identification. I mean, when you look at an animal still like that presented to you, you cannot help but identify and feel part of it. It's a way of putting yourself into the piece without being so direct or obvious. And we are animals. And also there's a relationship to animals in our sort of animal past. We're disconnected now, but really we're more influenced by our history, our ancestry, deep, deep time ancestry, our animal natures, than I think we're aware of. Like in the Beast of Burden, the point of using these huge, massive, primitive almost bones is their brutish, sort of earthbound nature. But then to juxtapose that in the form of a rocket is to also call up where we're going as a species. Here we are, animals with our aggression, but at the same time, we're absolutely divine creatures reaching for the stars and trying to understand the limits of the universe. But we're still carrying our past and who we are. That's part of who we are.
Your materials have included bird bones, snake bones, large animal bones like horses and cows, also moths and worms. Where do you get your materials?
They're everywhere. If people looked, they would see these things everywhere. I go for a walk with someone and they walk right over a mouse skeleton. They don't even see it. I go to a motel and outside of the motel in the cheesy little lamps outside your room, they're filled with old moths. I remember taking the light apart in a hotel in Tacoma and outside of Death Valley, just lifting the light off, and out spilled all these white moths. And I looked at them and they had little black eyes and they were this shape. They looked like I was holding a handful of ghosts. It was incredible. So things are everywhere. I mean, spiders are in the kitchen. People just don't get on their knees and look at these things. It's all around us. Cow.
And many of the animals that you use in your work are mummified. How do you mummify a dead animal, or do you find them that way?
Sometimes I find them mummified, complete in the desert, and sometimes I find, like a roadkill coyote, and I have cages out back that I call rot dam cages. Big ones, medium, little ones. And I put the animals in there and let the ants and scarab beetles and everything completely hollow them out.
How long does that take?
It takes a while because they do naturally mummify on the West Coast. On the East Coast, you can't do that.
Because it's
they
too
just
damp?
rot down into bones. But here, you can put a carcass out and the skin will turn to leather and mummify. And then I go through a laborious process of preserving them so they are archival.
Do you have a favorite kind of bone? Horse, cow, bird, gopher,
No,
snake?
Absolutely not. They're all fabulous forms. Some forms are just great to look at. Snake vertebrae are incredibly complex. How they fit together so that they can move and lock in place. They're incredible to look at, but different bones for different things. I like a nice, big, dense cattle leg bone to carve. But then I'll want ribs for their lyrical quality. And I'll want bird bones for their light, airy quality. What I'd love to get would be a whale vertebrae, because then I could carve I have an idea for an entire face. The Inuit used to carve bones. And the marrow inside of the bone is an incredible substance to carve. It's just
to carve. I thought you were going to say the marrow would be to eat.
No. When the blood drains out and it hardens, it's phenomenal. There's a sculpture called Inherent that I carved out of a cattle leg bone, and the top of it is a coiled snake that is carved from the bone marrow. And it's like carving soap bubbles. They're incredibly delicate, but you can even burnish them. It's a particular texture that's
So that
interesting.
it's not fragile in that it comes apart when you're working on it.
You have to be careful. Yeah. If you're carving with a Dremel tool and you slip, that's it. So you're careful, but it's fun.
Where do you get your cattle bones? From a slaughterhouse?
For the rocket in particular, and this piece, I drove thousands of miles. And I take these white buckets with me, big old 5-gallon paint buckets, and drive along cattle fields and look for a dead cow with binoculars. Hop out, hop the fence, and go get the bones, bring them back, and bleach them and sand them and carve them and clean them up.
Don't you have to fight the coyotes?
You can certainly tell where coyotes have been. Occasionally I'll go into ranches, just cold turkey, drive into a ranch, and ask the people if they have a boneyard. Because if a horse or a cow dies, generally they haul it out back and they have a little area for their dead animals. And I have to explain to them carefully that I'm making something with it. I'm not into witchcraft or anything. I used to tell them when I was looking for the rocket bones, well, I'm going to build a 9-foot rocket. They thought that was unbelievable. That was not true at all. So I just ended up saying, I'm making something. I'm primarily influenced by science, and I read a lot of natural history. And I belong to like Skeptical Inquirer and get Scientific American, and that's what I enjoy reading. And those some of the ideas are far-reaching, and I love the feeling in paleontology and history of going back billions of years, the millions of lives that have come before us that have evolved into where we are right now. I love things like that, or deep time. I love the exploding supernovas and multi-dimensional time, and those are elements of abject wonder for me. And I'm a wonder junkie, so I love that stuff.
That started as a child.
Yes, I think it starts naturally when you just open your eyes and start looking around if you're a curious person. I'm definitely a curious person.
I think so.
But it's not just that. Those are sources of wonder for me, but the ideas don't really come from them. They're sources of inspiration. But if you take that realm that they come from and then juxtapose it with life and the dichotomies in life, that's where the fruit comes from, the ideas. I mean, life is fabulous, but then there's death, and the macro and the micro, and the aggression and the beauty. I mean, religion versus science, nothing versus something. Those are the things that are inspiring.
Do you see any future transitions in your work?
The works tend to flow of their own accord. In looking at my own history, I can see how some of the essence has changed as I've changed. At one point, the work seemed to be very heavy, very dark, emerging out of the mud. The Sibyl of Lydda is a very dark piece, and they seem to be transitioning into a more ethereal nature. These bird heads, I call these birds with human heads, have a very ethereal nature. So they seem to be getting lighter. I think hitting middle age and realizing what you have is so limited and what's around you is so precious and can be just so unbelievably beautiful. That can't help but influence me knowing how mortal I am. Yeah.
Can creativity be taught?
You can teach technique. You can teach materials. You can't teach creativity. You can help open the door to show possibilities of what's been and what can be done, and even help someone realize their vision and get more in touch with who they are. But you cannot bless them with creativity. You can't.
Yeah.
Or ideas, or inspiration, or patience to do the work. You can't.
Okay, let's take a trip. Go in and talk about the actual work. This is a work in progress. And the heads are made out of, they're not bone, they're not carved.
The head and the bird body are made out of clay, but the tail is the tip of a rib.
Ah.
So that it still relates to the ribs.
Uh-huh.
But they'll be painted to match.
And these are cattle ribs?
Cattle, probably some horse and some smaller animals too, maybe even sheep.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And
Goat.
there might be a couple of dogs.
Yeah.
Might be some goat too.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So it's a smattering of different ribs. It has the feeling to me of the moon and these creatures, these bird, mythical sort of bird human head. They almost feel like the spirit of a human turned into a bird. And that they're all waiting and almost all dreaming on this other world. Very silent, mute, quiet moon.
What is the box?
The box is a votive box from Europe.
What is a votive box?
People would have these in the entrance of their homes, and they would have special religious objects and things in them. And I saw the box at an antique store. It was kind of falling apart and chipped and everything, but I thought it was so heavy and interesting that I had to have it. And then I brought it home and then thought about it, and then the idea just came. It was like, oh, that's what goes in it. But sometimes I'll get an object and wait for the idea to fill out around it. It's so personal to me.
Why?
Because I identify with it so heavily. I love thrashers, and I've always...
Oh, the bird is a
right.
California thrasher,
right? And I have a thrasher who lives out here who imitates my whistle, and the very introverted nature of the face and the quietness of the piece.
The face is very similar to the much smaller faces
Right.
on the piece in the studio.
Right.
Do you cast or do you mold?
I just mold them.
Or carve?
Just make them. Yeah. This is a build up rather than a subtraction. It's twine just wrapped and wrapped around and around and around, and then sewn to get the shape of the lids and the nose. And so I build it up, and then the covering on it to give it a ghostly feel is cat hair, a film of cat hair. I do like surprises in my materials in the work. It's seductive, but it's also ties into the meaning of the piece. This galaxy's made out of bone dust. It's actually filings of bone that are sprinkled onto a medium.
What was the medium?
Matte medium. First I cut a piece of aluminum, spray painted it black, then you put down little squares of matte medium to work on. And then the globe around it, the convex glass, adds a three-dimensional quality. But it's made out of bone dust, which is calcium, because all of the heavy elements in the world, in the universe, come from exploding supernova and exploding stars. All of the heavy elements are formed in stars. So here we are looking at a galaxy made out of bone dust, which creates our very bones. So we're really, as Carl Sagan said, star stuff looking at stars.
The ceiling is like being inside of an aviary. Is there a story on the ceiling?
I love birds. I love wings. I love flight. They're just pure spirit to me. They're beautiful.
And everywhere you move, these go on your ceiling?
Right. The first thing I do when I move into a place is throw the bed down on the floor and put the wings up on the ceiling. That means I'm home.
Are they always the same?
Never the same.
Never the same.
Depending on the environment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And these are wings that have not yet been included in work?
No.
Will they ever? Maybe?
Some may. Yeah, some may. But this is my own private work. You know, my own private installation. There's a piece called 6 Seconds Before Midnight, and they're animal heads coming out of horns. When you look at it from the side, you don't see any animals. So it's kind of a surprise when you come around to the front. It has to do, this one has a couple of layers in meaning. It can either be a warning that you might need to hear, or it could be perceived as a warning from the planet as the species are being killed.
And the longest is what animal?
Skunk.
Okay.
Skunk found at the beach.
Uh-huh.
The girlfriend, she was mortified, bent down and like, Barbara, turn away. I'm getting the skunk now.
And to the left of the skunk?
This ground squirrel I found in the backyard.
And in back of the ground squirrel?
There's a skink, a large skink, and a turtle, and a crow.
Crow. And then what is the one in the middle, basically, the shorter one? That's also, did you say that's also a skunk?
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. So they're two skunks, just because they have such great little ferocious teeth. Yeah. This is an older piece called the Sibyl of Lydda, and it's a horse muzzle in an old vent duct with sculpted wood around it, and copper tubing, and lizard heads and hands. And the Sibyl these were people that were priestesses that were kept in caves or under temples, and they would rant.
When?
Before the Middle Ages, a long time ago, and they would prophesy. The Sibyl of Delphi is a famous one, and I thought, what is it like to be confined in the dark with incense and goats and starved until you go to another world in your mind? And I thought that sometimes through limitation, you can go to different places.
The image of Albert Einstein on a tortilla. I've always been curious, how did you do that?
It was really fun. Some pieces are labor, like the giant rocket. That is labor and you work. This thing was fun every second. I bought a bunch of tortillas. I burned them in a frying pan. And they burned in such a way that they had some pattern to them. Then I bought a little cheap wood burner for like $5 at the hobby shop. And I burned his face onto the tortilla, tried to make it look like it was by accident. And the funny thing was when I've shown slides of that, people go, wow, it just happened like that because it looks so believable. And I tell them, yeah, and I had to throw out Kennedy and Cher, and I had to throw all these people, but till I got to Einstein. You know, really?
How did you make it permanent, the tortilla?
Oh, it is so permanent. It's saturated in Krylon medium. The whole tortilla is completely saturated with a plastic. And then the back has archival paper glued onto the back of it. But the saturated in plastic will keep it archival. It's been around for, I don't know, 8 years now.
Do you own that? Or?
No, I sold that.
Because then I thought, why a tortilla?
Oh, it's because it's making fun of religion. On a lot of people see Jesus in like cracks in the wood, and there's a famous one of Jesus appeared on this woman's tortilla, or the Virgin Mary in a spilled ice cream cone. And so I thought, okay, who is our time now? And that's really Einstein. I want Einstein to appear on the tortilla, not Jesus or Mary. That's what? Already, enough of them, you know? Einstein on the tortilla. And I mounted it on velvet with these mirror clips, so it's kind of got that hokey, you know. The Getty decided to do a series of 3 or 4 children's books done by fine artists. And they said, go ahead. They invited me to do this. To make a long story short, it was dropped in my lap. And they said, I said, well, it has no main character. There's not a complete sentence in it. And they said, well, I don't know if this will work. And it's their bestseller. I can't believe it's going to be 100,000. So kids are supposed to make up the rest of the story. You start with if cats could fly, and then the kid continues it. And I'm on my way to school, and the cat's following me, and I have mice for hair, and the cat's flying over me. So some of them kind of unconsciously connect, but some don't, like worms were wheels, just odd. My favorite, I think, is if dogs were mountains. Zebras had stars and stripes, and that one was made for my sweetheart Ed, musician, if music could be held. And I tried to make all the humans in it universal. Like this girl's looking right at you, but she has glasses on. So she could be anyone. And they have no clothes on to identify the time they're at. As if toes were teeth and caterpillars were toothpaste, and they could worm together and squish. And
Go back to leaves. If leaves were fish.
If leaves were fish.
I love that. That was the ad.
Yeah, that's the cover. And the poster. They made a poster. I made a different one, a more detailed one than that. That was the first one. Almost the first one. Might have been the second one.
Clouds for spirits.
Yeah.
How
now
wonderful.
there are all kinds of weird things in it too that people don't know. Butterflies were closed, like this one. If ants could count. There are 88 ants making the number 8 on page 18. I'm waiting for some kid to go like, oh, did you know there are 88 ants? If the moon were square. And then this one. This one actually says something. It's from my favorite poem that really describes how I see the world. It has a portion. It has a portion of it. It's from Lao Tzu. It's his initial poem, and it's existence is beyond the power of words to define. Terms may be used, but none of them are absolute. In the beginning, there were no words. Words sprang from the womb of matter. And whether a man dispassionately sees to the core of life or passionately sees the surface, the core and the surface are essentially the same, words making them seem different. If name be needed, Wonder names them both. From wonder into wonder, existence opens. A huge rocket out of cattle bones, but that to me is beyond what assemblage started as. It's not merely juxtaposing two things together without altering them.
Yeah. Do you have a label for yourself?
No.
Sculptor?
Sculptor is what I call myself, just a sculptor. Very open.
And have you always worked like this, or did you begin life as an artist in another medium?
I began life as an artist as a tiny, tiny little girl putting found objects together. That was my first thing, was making things out of seeds in the backyard and playing with grasses. And so it's very natural for me to work with primarily natural objects when I was little. And then I started drawing, and drawing very tight realism. I could draw people's portraits and things, and in high school you got a lot of strokes for that. And so I drew very realistically. At one point I even thought I might be a scientific illustrator. But my love is sculpture. I think in sculptural terms. When I'm imagining an idea, I see it three-dimensionally off the side of the freeway. And I drive way out towards Baker and Barstow and pick up the tires, throw them in the back of the truck, and bring them home. If they were the gorillas, have a steel armature inside, welded, and then the tires are wrapped around, cut and fitted exactly, drilled, and then sewn onto the steel armature.
What form does the armature take? Is it like just a T, or do you like
very detailed. It looks like a gorilla. It has rounded rebar inside, and then welded. It's not two-dimensional. I see the back and the sides and the front, and my sketches for the thing have all of those elements at once, like you're looking through the thing. It's actually easier for me to sculpt a face than to draw it. I just see the world that way.
The first memory I have of your work is that group of life-size gorillas in 1984 were at the Municipal Gallery. Those were made from tire treads?
They were made from the cast-off tires of primarily trucks and some cars.
Sarah Perry is a perfect example of what William Sight said in his definitive book in 1961 called The Art of Assemblage. And I quote, "Work is predominantly assembled rather than painted, drawn, modeled, or carved." But Sarah, you do it all.
Yeah, I actually have roots in assemblage by using found materials, but I no longer consider myself an assemblage artist because the materials are so altered and so sculpted that it doesn't read as two things or disparate objects just placed together. I will make